welcome. I'm thinking a lot about Carleton, obviously being here and going to university. I was talking with Roseanne about this. I sent my own daughter off to university just last week, so I'm thinking about the great times and what an exciting time it is at journalism school. And also, it is true that officially I graduated in 1996 because I never got my Canadian history credit that you need to get your version. And for a long time it was embarrassing, but Eddie actually reminds me that this is good now because I've taken 4 years off my age, really, publicly, as people sort of subtract back, like, oh, if you graduated in 96, how old are you? So it's working to my advantage now. And so, of course, as I was thinking about university in Carleton, I was so happy to come and moderate this panel. I was so pleased that Susan Harada called me to ask me to be involved. But, my first thought, much like Susan's, was, are we really still talking about this? I mean, I know lots of women in journalists. Look at us. Look at all around the room. My former employer at the Citizen, they're now led by this relatively young, dynamic woman. At CBC Ottawa, there's women in the ranks of reporters and editors and managers. And in fact, I'd argue that being a woman in journalism has given me a lot of advantages. People are trying to get more women into journalism. Whether they're doing a good enough job, we can discuss. So I'm asked, that's okay. There you go. So being a woman, though, you're in demand to be on panels, to be a commentator. And in fact, when I became the city columnist at the Citizen, my main competitor was a very well-qualified man. And we were vying to replace a pretty crusty old guy who'd been there a long time. And I know that being a woman actually was a part of the reason I got the job. I don't believe it's the only reason. I'm very well qualified for that job. But I know that that was part of it. And I'm not sure how I feel about that, because on the one hand, we want to get women in these jobs. On the other hand, we don't always feel great about the idea that we're getting that job because we're a woman. So it's a bit complicated. Still, I was saying to Susan, here we are. We're not doing too badly. She agreed, and we talked about this, and then we talked for an hour longer, and a lot of the issues that Susan brought up came up. We started to talk about sexual harassment, both the stories we're starting to tell in workplaces, in our own workplaces. The aggression against women, in particular on social media, broadcasters being harassed when they're doing their stand-ups, and the age-old problem of work-life balance in this profession that seems to get more and more demanding every year. So yeah, we're still talking about this, and that is what we're going to do here on this panel for a while, although we mostly would like to hear from you, your stories, your questions, your comments, but we're going to begin with these fantastic women. I'm going to start with Alicia.
Hi, it's really nice to be back here. This building was not done when I graduated, so I'm really jealous of, it looks amazing. Joanne had asked us to think about how being a woman has impacted our professional lives, and I'm just really lucky to say that I don't think it has, particularly because of all the amazing women that have come before. Every newsroom that I've worked in has been full of extraordinary, talented women at the highest levels of management. The Toronto Star, almost the highest level of management. I don't think we've had a female editor-in-chief that while I've been there, certainly. But I guess the one thing that I still feel a little bit is my position as a woman of color. I think there's still a lot more to be done in that area. So while I don't think being a woman has affected my hiring, decisions in hiring or anything like that, in fact, when I've been hired, it's always been the group of women has always been bigger than the men. Most of my colleagues in sort of my age group are mostly women. But I still feel, as a woman of color, that little bit of imposter syndrome that I think a lot of women before me have felt going into a male-dominated workplace, for example. So I think that's still the position of women of color is changing too, though, quite dramatically, even in the short time that I've been a journalist. So I think it's really, really positive. Yeah, and I think in 5 years things will look even more different than they do now.
Thank you. Anita?
So thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. Like Susan said, there's been a lot of doom and gloom about the industry, but as somebody, I'm sure most of you don't know what Fusion is. It's like a new media publication, and because of this transition into new media, it's such an exciting time for young journalists to enter the field. And I don't want to kind of espouse the same kind of doom and gloom that you often hear sometimes at journalism schools, because I remember going to Carleton and being told by some of my professors that, you know, it might be a hard it's a hard path to go, or a hard career to go into. But there's so many new opportunities, and I want to talk a bit about Fusion because it's kind of an amalgam of new media and old media, so legacy media and new media, and its approach is very innovative, but it also promotes very high editorial standards. So that is something that is like, it's kind of an amalgam of the best of both worlds. And one of the best things about Fusion is that more than 50% of its senior management is comprised of women, and more than 50% of its staff, its journalists, its editorial staff is comprised of people of color. So I think this is kind of, it's leading the way in terms of the way journalism is moving to more diverse perspectives, which is something that I think is really important for young journalists to understand, that it's not just kind of, journalism used to be traditionally dominated by a lot of white male perspectives, and now it's changing, which is very exciting.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Nita. Susan, do you want to move on? Well, look, let's keep on that track, because we had a little pre-conference confab, and that is one of the things that came up, that sort of women of color, diversity in the newsrooms. I'm going to throw this back out to Anita and Alicia first. How has that changed what you cover, how you cover it, and why is it important? I know we think that that's obvious, but I don't think we talk about it overtly enough, just out in the open. So, do you want to? Sure.
Well, I think it's so important, and I think it's not just diversity in ethnicity, but also just in every possible way, whether it's sexual orientation or in ages, and every possible way. It's so important to have a diverse newsroom, and especially at the Toronto Star and the Toronto market, which is such a multicultural city. I think it's really important to have a newsroom that's reflective of the city that you're covering, and I think there's always a concern that you're not representing or presenting the stories about certain populations. They can get missed, they can get overlooked, and certain angles are missed. And so we see in, for example, coverage of Black Lives Matter, which is a really controversial subject, even in Canada, and it's different in the States, I know. But I think a lack of diversity in Canadian media is reflected in that coverage. So I think it's really, really important to the quality of the media that we consume.
And you say there's a lot of women in senior management roles, as well as diversity in senior management. How does that change the dynamic, do you think, of that newsroom compared to other places you've worked?
It completely changes the dynamic. I feel like I've held senior roles at previous places, like at Complex and Mashable, both of which are new media publications. But I do think like the dynamic completely changes when you're not the only woman in a decision-making role, or the only person of color in a decision-making role. And I just think it makes for better journalism, just because there's respect for different people's perspectives. So, for example, every morning at my staff meeting, there's white people, Black people, South Asian people, East Asian people, people who are LGBTQ, and I just think that makes for a richer richer reporting, and it makes sure that Canada and the U.S. are both seeing a lot of immigration from diverse countries, and also just experiencing a boom in terms of diversity in our populations among citizens. So I think it's important to reflect that. And I do think it's just much more comfortable environment in which people can share their stories during staff meetings.
Susan?
Well, I won't address the diversity issue because it's been well discussed, and at the risk of jumping on a future question, sure. I wanted to just raise an observation that I've had for the last probably almost 10 years, maybe 8 years. There is a danger now that women have gotten to a quorum in media, there is a danger I'm seeing that it becomes, female ghetto is too strong a word, maybe, but I work with almost all women. Sometimes we joke on the National on Fridays, like Easter, it's the Women's Hour on the National because it's all women writers. Wendy's hosting it. It's all women. I don't think that's a good objective either. And I worry about the young women that I work with who don't see a path beyond what they're working at. And we're really good at what we do. And therefore, a lot of the associate producers are stuck in their positions of associate producing. And I am concerned about it getting overweighted, as perhaps, I don't know if the academics talk about this in journalism schools, but I really think we need strong young men coming into this profession. And I'm seeing currently it's at risk of being overweighted in certain strata of the media business. Food for thought.
Well, that is interesting, right? I mean, I come, when I look at columnists, still very male-dominated columnists, right, in this country. And, but at the Citizen where I came from, I mean, I was the first one, but then we had a woman editorial page editor, and she got women in, and now there's quite a few. And I don't think that's bad, but diversity still includes men. And how do we get people into this business? Because one of the problems I'm sure people have is as this business is becoming more challenging, it is to attract good people from all sorts of, walks of life, and also in the diversity issue too. We want to get people into newsrooms, but are we seeing them going through the journalism programs? And if they're not going through the journalism programs or whatever other road you can get to get into news, why not? What are the barriers there? I mean, how did you find your way into this business?
In a really traditional way,
Yeah.
where I
Why did you decide to come in?
Oh, why did I decide? Oh,
To become a journalist, yeah.
I think part of the reason was I'd always sort of wanted to be a journalist, and I, grew up watching Christian Amanpour and CNN, and was just, thought it was great. But I also really wanted to do an English literature degree, and so I was talking to my parents, and they thought, hey, why don't you try this thing that actually has a possible profession attached to it, and try both, and we'll see how it goes. And I started it, and I really enjoyed it, and I started off at CTV Ottawa and did an internship there, and that's how they hired me on to do weekend and night reporting, and then I got an internship at the Star and did that, and they hired me on after that. So,
were your parents open to that? I'm curious because my parents are like, Italian immigrants, like, are you out of your mind? Like, what are you doing, right? And, well, part of it is like, they don't know any journalists, right? I mean, you know the people you know, right? And so this is great when you and Anita are in this business. It actually, if that profession actually looks like you, maybe you will go into it, right? So I'm wondering, your parents were open to that? Only because you wanted to take English, though, right?
Yeah, this is the better option. And they also still remind me that law school is still open. So, I mean, there's that. Yeah, it was just a really traditional route into it. But I would just add that people have talked a lot about unpaid internships and things like that, and I think that is a huge barrier, I think. And the length of time it takes. I was really lucky because all my internships have been paid. And I managed to transition. I've basically always been paid to be a journalist, and that is incredibly like a lucky thing. Like most people don't have that that trajectory. So that's a huge barrier. That means a lot of people who are amazing and would be incredible voices just don't get in the door or can't wait the amount of time that you have to wait.
Anita, I know you worked at a lot of different places as well. What I see actually with Citizen and CBC, people on contracts, people on casual basis, they're awesome, but that is not a stable life. I know you've gone through a lot of different organizations, you probably deal with a lot of freelancers. How does that affect journalism?
So it's interesting. Well, I wanted to talk about initially. Can I?
Yes,
is it okay
please.
if I
Oh,
can-
yeah, absolutely. You talk about whatever you like.
Yeah. I also started, my foundation is from legacy media, but I did encounter, although I'm so grateful for that experience, and I'm grateful for, for my experience at Carleton, I definitely did experience, there was, the majority of management at the time when I was there were men and white men at that. So I found that a lot of my story ideas were rebuffed, and the reason why new media was so exciting to me was the fact that I felt like for the first time, it wasn't, just a group of 10 editors who come from similar backgrounds dictating what news should be out there, right? So with new media, it's kind of controversial because a lot of it relies on traffic. So it's like page views, how many people are coming to your site. But in a lot of ways, that's instructive because people on the internet are a lot of young people, and there are a lot of people of color and a lot of women who are kind of expressing the desire to see stories that represent themselves. And so for me, it was very freeing to work in new media to be able to, bring those stories to fruition. But on the flip side, like you were saying, there are also a lot of problems in terms of standards in new media, which is why I'm glad I'm at Fusion, because they really do prioritize editorial standards. And because there's a lack of, especially in the US, what I've observed is there are a lot of writers, not trained journalists coming into the fray, and a lot of freelancers, so there's just, they don't know best practices. Oftentimes they don't know the editorial process, even in terms of pitching and going through drafts of edits. And so the standard is definitely not as strong in some respects. And something I'm sure we're going to talk about later is opinion-based journalism that is not kind of rooted in fact is also very rampant. There's a lot of like citizen journalism that doesn't have an institution behind it that's kind of pushing out really a lot of misinformation. And so that's also a barrier, as well as like the industry is changing.
Well, let's jump to this, because one of the things I forgot to mention earlier is that, yes, we are all women in journalism, but we don't actually have to talk only about women in journalism. And something we had talked about ahead of time was sort of the disappearance of truth. And I think that, Susan, you mentioned that the Time magazine called this the post-truth politics. And part of it is what Anita's talking about. And maybe you can talk about why this is so alarming to all of us.
I think it is. I think it's we're sort of getting into the adolescence maybe of social media. Maybe we're not even that old yet, but now we're starting to sort of question not the genre, way beyond that. But we used to live in London, and I read The Guardian a lot, and I subscribed to a weekly email, the long reads in the Guardian newspaper. And recently the public editor wrote a long and impassioned story about the fact that the internet had made it more difficult, not less now, to find the truth. So that our reporting now is so influenced by the internet that the truth gets buried. And now we're seeing the uptake of that in American political life right now, the absence of truth. And some people say it's not, people don't care about it anymore. This is something I think as journalists we all have to worry about and make it harder to report. As I always say, go there where the story is. Being there is more important than anything else, because so many of us, with the increasing demands, are re-reporting what we read on the internet, even from good sources, that sometimes is misreported. There's nothing better than being there, as I tell my editors all the time, send me, because there's nothing better than being there to see your own truth represented in the people you're talking to, some of whom I mentioned in my remarks.
And also, it's the pace of the reporting now, I don't want to see the government's take on their budget. I want to see the numbers. Give me the documents. I want to see the original documents, but sometimes it takes a long time, and your newscast is at 5:30 or 6. I don't even know when the newscast is. It's terrible. My boss is sitting right here. I can't even say what time the newscast is. But, you want to get it online before everyone else so that the search engines find your story first. And, getting the original numbers out there are harder. So what has your experience with this been, Alicia?
It's interesting. Yeah, we see in our newsroom a lack of, I guess, people being sent out into the field more and more, right? There's a heavier focus on digital, people doing a lot of reporting from their desks. I am lucky enough to have an office in the courthouse that I do a lot of my reporting out of, and I love that. It's amazing. I walk through the hallways and I chat with people, and that's how I stumble into amazing stories all the time. It's like a crucial part to building sources and to learning about my beat. And it's just, I couldn't imagine having to do the same job out of the newsroom. But there used to be a bunch of media who had offices in that building. Now there's 3 of us.
Yeah. Or they're coming in and out, and they don't have that continuity. They don't understand the nuances of the legal business or the case that you do, right?
Exactly. There's just there's a decline in beat reporting. I think that across the board. And as younger people join the industry and as older people leave it, there's this sort of what I think is like a gap in that middle area of people who are in the middle of their careers and have accumulated all this knowledge, but have transitioned out and left this sort of gap between people who are starting off like myself and people who are at sort of the end of their careers.
I find myself one of the old people in the newsroom someday. I'm not sure I love that, but there's absolutely that dynamic going on. Anita?
Yeah, there's definitely this tension and the gap that's being filled. I think there's like, it's a really opportune time for places like Fusion, which are rare, where they can kind of like combine like the high standards of like legacy media with like innovative reporting and a new approach to covering diverse populations. But it is kind of a scary time to be a young journalist graduating, because I feel like as legacy media outlets are shrinking, there are less opportunities to get really good training. Like my best training that I've ever had was definitely at the Star and the Globe, and it set the tone for it's like set completely. I owe those two publications for making me the journalist I am today, and also bringing that background and that expertise to new media and being able to kind of lead the transition. Because I find that a lot of young writers that I've managed, they immediately go to like a new media publication and some are better than others, but a lot of them are not great. So they go in and they don't actually even understand, like, I should pick up the phone, I shouldn't just email, I should go to the scene. This is not something that really occurs to them. And although, J-School can only do so much, you really need the actual real life practice. And so that's a concern of mine.
I would agree, and I think it's a really important disruptive influence right now that we're all going through. And I think as the demands, I know every generation of journalists, say some of you are probably saying, "Oh yeah, your work is hard." I don't think anybody who's a working journalist today would disagree that this is one of the most disruptive half decades that we've experienced as working journalists. It is phenomenal. Just in the number of jobs alone, I used to be a television broadcaster. Now I'm a television broadcaster, a radio broadcaster, an online writer, a live hitter,
Tweeter.
all in the same day. Tweeter, taking my own video. It is extraordinary. And I think that without saying, I want an easier job, I don't. But, at some point, we want a diversity of skills. And what I mean by that is some people thrive on that kind of demand. I think I do, and I'm not saying I'm better, it's my DNA. But some people don't. Some people need more time to think about what's underneath a story, and we need to make room for these type of journalists as well, or we're going to lose something. And I'm hearing what you're saying when I think now about my own environment. We don't have time anymore to mentor. I barely have time to speak to my associate producer about anything except, are we going to make the deadline at 2 o'clock this afternoon? So we need to guard against the depreciation of the profession of journalism, the day-to-day job, and remind ourselves that some of these things that we've just talked about are critical to reporting. How to recognize, not just writing, how to recognize spin. People coming in, are we making sure that they know what spin look like? It's getting better and better. It's getting more difficult to decipher the truth from a presentation. And there are legions more people employed in spinning their story than there are those of us trying to unpack the spin.
So I'm just going to transition. I would like to open it up, but I think there's one important subject we all wanted to talk about. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of comments about this, so we'll talk about it a bit and then open it up to the floor. And it is, I think, one of the key issues is that as more women are in journalism, as we have more women managers, are we changing the way we cover some stories, some subjects, and I have to say in particular stories of sexual assault and sexual harassment?
I'm just going to jump in briefly.
Sure.
I think because we talked about this
Yes.
in our pre-conversation, and I think there is an interesting dynamic here because as women, covering a sexual assault complaint is we need added rigor because our community of women are expecting that in many cases that the woman is telling the truth, when we in fact know that sometimes women and men don't tell the truth about sexual assault. We need to be rigorous in applying the same dynamic and rigor to our investigation of something like assault, whether we come at it as a woman or a man. I was reflecting on Peter Mansbridge's interview with the lawyer for Jean Gomeshi. He asked her about, what reaction has there been to you defending Jean Gomeshi in this? And she, very hard-nosed, as she should be as a lawyer, I am looking this as my client. I am looking for the facts. And women can tell me what they think about me representing Jean Gomeshi or someone in a similar court case, but I don't care. I can't care. It's got to be very fact-based.
Now, I agree completely with on how we cover it. On the other hand, I would argue that if it weren't for more women in journalism, we would not see some of these issues as sexual harassment. I think that is starting to change. I'm going to go with, I know Alicia covers court. Anita, you are nodding your head. What do you folks think about that?
Oh, I completely agree.
But I know you've had the same experience that Susan has had about having to be very neutral, right?
Yeah, and I think that's what I've learned a lot, and I've done a lot of reporting on sexual assault in the last year, and Susan really described this much better than I did, but you really have to remember that you're a journalist, you're not someone's friend, you're not someone's confidant, and it's really hard when someone's telling you an incredibly difficult thing and sharing incredibly personal things with you to set up those barriers, but that's something that is incredibly important to do because you're not there to go like, yeah, that's awful and I'm so sorry, but also to write a story and also to apply all the sort of journalistic standards that you would apply to your reporting of any story. But I think it's interesting to watch the coverage of things like the Gomeshi case because in that courtroom, it was just full of women journalists. There were a lot of women covering that story, and I think that does change the way we cover those kinds of stories because there is a degree, I think, of empathy and understanding. I was just thinking...
A recognition that is actually...
It's a real
something.
And horrifying, painful assault, and there's a lot of... Like, going back, it was, I think, in 1992 or something like that, when domestic violence was actually considered to be a really bad thing. We didn't criminalize it in the same way that we do now. We just thought it was treated as something that's less serious rather than more serious. And that's not that long ago. And it's the same thing with sexual assault. We still are dealing with what kind of impact does rape have on a person? How bad is it really? So in that way, I think that it has made a difference because most women will experience some form of harassment. Most women can, in some ways, identify with that. That said, that doesn't mean men can't report on it.
No, in fact,
Absolutely.
the Gomeshi case was written in the Star by
absolutely,
men. So,
right?
just to be clear. Anita?
I completely agree with Alicia and Susan. I think it's just it's positive. I mean, definitely you have to cover it in a fair and balanced way, but the fact that these stories are being unearthed and covered more often is a testament to the fact that there probably are more women journalists covering these issues, and also other types of coverage too. There's there are more op-eds about, say, rape culture in the country, and so there's just more coverage on a broader level, which is positive, and it's a positive development.
I think we're just going to open up to some comments because we're running a little bit late. Surprise, surprise. But yes, so there's 2 microphones here, and I
or
thought
just
that
shout
Heather
it
was
out
going to
and
actually come and
project.
or just say thank you. Hello.
Hello. I have a question. It's not quite in line with what you were just talking about.
Ask whatever you like.
It's a question for Anita, and it's a bit of a continuation of a conversation we had a few weeks ago. I'm just continuing it now. You've talked a little bit about your experience in new media, and I'm wondering if you could talk more about your experience in the U.S. versus Canada and the diversity that you see there versus here, if there is any difference.
Oh, yeah. I feel like that's a great question. I feel like Canadian journalism is definitely more measured and balanced, and America is interesting in that there's definitely a lot of recklessness, but on the flip side, there's a lot of innovation, which is what drew me to move to the States in the first place, for obvious reasons. I mean, I focus on social justice coverage, I focus on race relations, and for obvious reasons, that's much more of a hot-button topic in the U.S. But I think the primary difference is that this isn't a knock on Canadian journalism at all because my foundation is here and I'm really grateful for it. But I do think because it's such a much bigger population and a much more diverse population, there are a lot of media startups like mine that are popping up that are covering different perspectives, and they're much more willing. For example, like at Fusion, there's a entire department dedicated to innovation and engagement, which the department kind of liaises with academic institutions and think tanks to think of ways to approach journalism in more innovative ways. And I feel like there are a lot of discussions in, this is generalization, I guess, but Americans are much more open about discussing very controversial topics, especially with regards to race. And so I know the Globe just recently debuted a podcast called Color Code, and I felt like that was about race relations, and I felt like that was a long time coming. It's great that a mainstream media outlet's finally addressing race in Canada, but it took quite a bit of time. So I guess that's the main difference.
I feel like we're just starting to address Indigenous issues in Canada in the same way, very far behind. But there's people. Thank you. Hi.
So you guys talked about changes in ethnic diversity, and I'm not sure that this question can be answered because you don't often go up to a coworker and ask how much money their family made. But I was wondering if you guys have any observations on the diversity in socioeconomic backgrounds.
No, that's an excellent question. I'm not sure. You have to actually end up getting to know everyone. I don't know what we would say to that. Do you have any ideas? Or?
Well, I can make assumptions, not based on fact, but I would assume that that is one of the underrepresented areas that I'm talking about. In a developed country like ours, the strata of people who go into journalism, it's not hugely paid in this country. And I think that does explain some of the attrition. People who want to make a more stable income leave the profession, but coming in, yes, I don't think we're drawing from as a wide enough population of people in that respect either.
And I'm not sure whose responsibility it is. It's someone's, and maybe we can talk about this through the school here, through the journalism school here. But who's going out to these various areas, to Indigenous kids, to new immigrant kids who may be poor, to say, you could be a journalist. I know it doesn't seem like you could be, but you could, and here's how to do it. Because it's not just enough to say, yeah, we'd like to have you. This is sort of, in my day, it was always like, we'd really like you to be this manager of this. I'm like, well, I have this, small kids, blah, blah. I'm like, oh, that's too bad. Well, that's not the answer. The answer is not, you fit our template. The answer is, all right, if we think that we need you, what do we have to do, or how can we get you here? And that's really not happening, I don't think. You guys want us to mention that?
I think, like Alicia mentioned earlier, there's like a barrier to entry in journalism in general just because so many internships are unpaid, which I feel, frankly, is very unethical. So, that's definitely a consideration. But, I think you can draw parallels with, there's a lot of people of color, especially in the U.S. and Black and Latino communities that are socioeconomically disadvantaged. And so I think it's just a matter of bringing in more diversity on the whole. Chances are you will attract people who are from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds, which is really important in terms of informing the reporting because you have a much more compassionate approach. And it's just a different perspective, again, that's really essential.
Yeah, I think it's been really well covered.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm curious about what everyone thinks journalism will look like in 5 years, given it's a post-truth environment with different diversities.
That's a depressing question in my mind.
That's yours.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks. I was going to give it to the younger reporters who will be here in 5 years, I'd like to say. I think, no, not me, not you. I'm just saying. Look, I don't know. I think, obviously, there's a huge push for digital reporting. I think, having come very recently from the private sector, there's a huge challenge as to how to pay for that, right? Everybody wants to read it online, but nobody wants to pay for it online. So somewhere there's a big disconnect. I don't think newspapers will completely disappear, the paper versions. I do think, though, we're going to see papers that were dailies will be weeklies. And actually, when I started at the Financial Post, lo, those many years ago, you know, our weekday paper was a little tab, and the weekend paper was a big paper. And I can see areas where you get a big weekend paper and not a daily. There's a real push to put news to your phones, right? Where people are. So I'm going to let you guys answer some of these, including Susan, who will be here for many, many, many years. So.
Damn right.
Yeah, well, especially currently at Fusion and Mashable, where I was before, which is a tech-focused publication, there's a huge push to video and mobile.
Yeah.
And so, like, there's a concern among a lot of new media journalists where, like, video is going to cannibalize text, which I don't believe is going to happen because text is awesome and it's essential and it informs video. So it's kind of like there's a lot of change in terms of working out how they can be complementary, how you can, so I work very closely with our video team. We're very embedded together to kind of think like how can we present this story in a video format versus text format versus social. There's a lot more tools at our disposal. And also I just think in terms of, there's also like more of a push towards perspective-based journalism, which I know this is something that's already covered. Like legacy media obviously has a rich history of perspective journalism, but for example, a Fusion, instead of being like completely balanced, like neutral, our mandate is to be fair, but not necessarily balanced. For example, if you're covering a story on people who are anti-vaccine, you're going to give more, you know, you're going to give more space to the 90, like the experts who kind of tell you, are informing you to like vaccinate your children. And it's just like perspective-based journalism at Fusion is very much like rooted in, you know, diverse perspectives and also from like people of color. So I think that's also, there's a push towards that as well. Like being transparent about the fact that you are coming from a specific like point of view.
How do you think we're going to be delivering the news in 5 years? Or where are we going, do you think?
It's not going to look like today, I can assure you of that. I see a couple of warning signs. I embrace digital fully and enjoy the new opportunity. But for example, we're going through this, how do we grab the millennials phase in media? And what that means is we're trying all kinds of different things. So it's not video versus digital, it's all of those things. So we're cutting up little pieces, which has its downside. We're also taking packages in television broadcasting. It has changed dramatically and will continue to change at a rapid pace. We're taking the packages that we learned how to do in this school and continue to do. So media reports, video reports, where there's a script, there's editing, there's visuals, putting them all together. Now what's being pushed out by my organization is 30 seconds text on video. So they take all the work that I do and then they put it video only with written text on it and put it on Facebook and say that's all we're going to push out. So it's a little worrisome about depth. Where are we going to see the depth? I hope it breaks up into depth for those who want it on certain platforms and sort of 30 seconds, you know, we're going to tease you for those who want it in other platforms. I don't know. I'm not a soothsayer in this one.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I actually think that we're going to see a lot more of a push towards depth-based journalism. And like Mother Jones is doing something really innovative in the States where they've asked for sort of crowd-funded investigations. They've done an incredible one in for-profit prisons, and they met their funding goal almost immediately. So I think that instead of doing sort of the more typical daily journalism that we associate with newspapers and that sort of thing, I think there's going to be a shift into either this sort of micro journalism where things are out there really quickly and then into sort of really long-term investigations, because I think that's what people really want to read, is just getting the money to do them, right? It's those things that cause change.
You get depth on demand? Like, so
yeah, it's just that's the thing.
That's
but I
good.
think,
I like that. I'm going to nobody steal that. I'm going to copyright that immediately after this. We're going to have our last question, actually. Hi.
Hi, thank you. Oh, I never wear heels, so I don't know. So this is directed to the entire panel. You know, as Susan, as you mentioned in your keynote, I mean, despite the volume of women in this industry, there are still a lot of men at the helm and editor positions and so on and so forth. And as more women join men at the top, do we have a responsibility as women in journalism, to seek out, or rather report on, issues that are centered on women's issues, women's rights, sort of curate the news to, shine the light on marginalized societies because we were at one point marginalized? Or is it rather we just have a duty to be the best reporter, journalist we can be as an act of again, shining the light on women and women's issues and female newsmakers in society?
Really good question. I think I'll answer it this way, that each of us, as I ham-fistedly explained, has a different carry-on. So I think we all bring to storytelling our particular experience. So women is part of my experience. I'm also a prairie girl and, all kinds of different other experiences. So I think, yes, we should work on what we bring to it and shine lights on areas that we think are important because other people in our community of that kind will. On the other hand, if I were running CBC News, I would also be
In 5 years, everyone. That's what's going to be happening.
I would also be concerned that we weren't overweighting, and I've described my concern about that we overweight positions. Something you didn't ask about, but I do very much value mentorship. I don't think we're very good at it in general in journalism, and I think as a manager, I would want more of that, to encourage more of that mentorship.
I think you've spoken so eloquently about it, but one of the things that I sort of view as one of the things I actively do is seek out women authority figures and experts and things like that when I'm doing stories to make sure that there is a balance, that the best voices are being heard, but also that there's a diversity among those voices. And there's been a really big push at that at the Star as well, just sort of editorially, to make sure that even when you're just doing streeters, to make sure that you're sort of getting a broad cross-section of voices. But in particular, making sure that sort of female professors and experts and things like that are getting the platform that they deserve, not just because they're women, but because they're sort of the best in their positions, and we should be reflecting that appropriately.
At the follow-up panel, we should talk about how hard it is sometimes to get women to talk to us. That is a whole other discussion where we want them to talk, but they're like, I can't, I don't know enough about this, blah, 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 and that's got to stop. But that's for another day. Anita?
Everybody said everything so eloquently. But just to add to Alicia, it's also the way you present the news. It's not just like visually too. I think that's really important because that's what people respond to immediately. So when you go to a newspaper or like somebody's website, you want to see like people of color. You want to see women reflected, and it just seems like such a small thing. But even the decision to like put, if you're going to use a stock photo or you're going to use a photo or a crowd shot, you want to make sure it reflects what accurately reflects. For example, if you're covering a story in Toronto, you want to make sure it reflects the diversity of the population as well. So those are things that, as I, now that I'm in a senior position, I make a concerted effort to do in my day-to-day.
I would say, just as a closing remark, that I think as journalists, all of us have a responsibility to voice the issues of marginalized groups. Because they are marginalized, they do not have a voice. We have a very powerful voice. And it's why it's so important to have diversity in your newsroom, because different people from different walks of life are going to understand those marginalized groups better. I don't really understand the issue of being a Somali immigrant in this city. And I know that my colleague, who is, her background is a Somali woman, has a better shot at it. And will also actually be able to know what those issues are. And so that's why we have to push for more women, more people of color, more Indigenous people, just a plethora of different folks in all of our newsrooms. So that is it for us. Thank you so much, all of you.